Hi, 7th graders. We're going to talk about quadrilaterals today. So quadrilaterals, that base word or root word quad literally means four. So quadrilaterals are any four-sided polygon, so a closed shape that has four straight sides. So we could just have a four-sided shape and we just call that a quadrilateral. There are a lot of other specific names for quadrilaterals as well, so we're going to go through those really quickly. So if you have a quadrilateral that has exactly one pair of parallel sides, so parallel meaning you can think train tracks or never ever going to run into each other. One set of parallel sides, we call that a trapezoid. And you'll notice that they are indicating that this trapezoid has a set of parallel sides by these little arrows there. So then when we have another way that we might have quadrilaterals is we can have quadrilaterals that we call parallelograms. So that's when we have opposite sides that are parallel and congruent. So a couple things I want to point out, a couple of different symbols. Again, you can see these little arrows here that are showing you that those sides of the parallel are congruent. So these two sides are, this side is parallel to that side, and this side is parallel to that side. So the top is parallel to the bottom, and the two sides are parallel to each other. The double arrows on the top and the bottom are telling you that the top and the bottom are parallel to each other. As far as congruency goes, these little dashes on the sides tell us that those two sides are congruent to each other, and then the double dashes tell us that the top and the bottom are also congruent to each other. So when we have a quadrilateral that has opposite sides that are parallel and congruent, we call that a parallelogram. From there we have multiple different categories. So you might just have a parallelogram that is only a parallelogram and doesn't have these other specific traits. But if you have a parallelogram that has four right angles also, we call that a rectangle. If you have a parallelogram that has four congruent sides, we call that a rhombus. And then when you have a parallelogram that has the four right angles and the four congruent sides, we call that a square. And one other way that you can classify quadrilaterals is called a kite. And so a quadrilateral that has two pairs of congruent adjacent sides. So if we look at that, we can tell that these two sides are adjacent and they're also congruent. And these two sides are adjacent and also congruent. And then if we look at the opposite sides, so this side and this side, they are not congruent. So that's how you would technically define a kite. A lot of times a kite looks like what you think a kite looks like. But what you need to know about the quadrilateral hierarchy and how we name these different shapes is that the best name for a quadrilateral is the most specific. So, for example, the square, which if you just think of what a square is, the best name for a square is going to be a square. However, technically, a square is also a rectangle, it's also a rhombus, it's also a parallelogram, and it's also a quadrilateral. So it also fits within all these other classifications, but the best name for it is a square. Same thing with like a parallelogram. If you had a shape like this that does not have the four right angles or four congruent sides, but it has opposite sides parallel and congruent, we could call it a parallelogram. We can also call it a quadrilateral. The best name for it, though, is the parallelogram. So we're going to look at some of these statements really quick and complete these. So here it says a square is blank a parallelogram. We're going to complete these with always, sometimes, or never. So if I look at this chart, a square is blank a parallelogram. Well, a square is under a parallelogram. So remember, a parallelogram has opposite sides that are parallel and congruent. When we look at a square, I have opposite sides that are parallel. I have opposite sides that are congruent, so a square is always going to be a parallelogram. So we can say that, but remember, we'll still usually call it just a square because that's the best name for it. A kite is blank a parallelogram. So over here, remember the kite has opposite sides that are not congruent, and the parallelogram has opposite sides that are congruent. So a kite is never going to be a parallelogram. A rhombus is blank a square. So a rhombus is a parallelogram with 4 congruent sides. A square does have the 4 congruent sides. So sometimes a rhombus might be a square, but not always. And a parallelogram is blank a trapezoid. So the trapezoid has exactly 1 pair of parallel sides. The parallelogram has 2 sets of opposite sides parallel. So a parallelogram is never a trapezoid. So that's a little bit about classifying quadrilaterals. So then when we talk about the angles in a quadrilateral, this is going to be based off of what we know about the angles in a triangle. So the first thing we're going to do, we're going to draw a diagonal line to cut the quadrilateral in half. So I'm going to draw a diagonal there. And so if we look, I've just actually formed 2 triangles. So I have a triangle here and a triangle here. So every quadrilateral is going to every quadrilateral will be made out of 2 triangles. And if we think about what we know, I know that this triangle is going to add up to 180 degrees, and the angles in this triangle will add up to 180 degrees. So if I want to think about what the sum of the angles in a quadrilateral must be, 180 plus 180 is going to give me 360 degrees. So now that I know that, I'm going to be able to solve for missing angles in a quadrilateral. So here I have a quadrilateral with angles of 76 degrees, 123 degrees, and 85 degrees, and then this missing angle. So I know that all 4 of those angles are going to need to add up to be 360 degrees. And so I can add up my constants and my like terms there. And I do not have a calculator handy, so I'm just going to be doing this by hand. So 123 plus my 85, 120 would be 208 plus the 76 is going to be 284. So 284 plus b is going to equal 360 degrees. So I can subtract 284 from 360 and figure out that b is going to equal 76 degrees, I believe. Hopefully that's correct. All right, and then I had a little person knocking at my door during that problem. And then on our next one, again, I'm given 4 angles, so I can set up an equation. I know that 124 plus 75 plus 125 plus b needs to equal 360 degrees. On this one, it's pretty easy for me to add 75 plus 125, so that's 200, plus the 124, so 324 plus b equals 360. Zero out my 324. And so b is going to equal 36 degrees, I believe. So again, now that we know that triangles have a sum of 180 degrees, that helps us figure out that quadrilaterals will have a sum of 360 degrees. And once we know that, we can use that information to solve for missing angles. Have a great day.